So if there was ever going to be a video where I catch a ban, it's going to be this one, because I made a video similar to this where I just basically showed the crisis of banking in China, and then I caught a 7-day ban indiscriminately. There was no reason. They didn't tell me a reason when I appealed it. They said appeal immediately denied and didn't tell me why. That's the first time that's ever happened. But I'm going to still talk about China, and I'm not trying to do it in a disparaging way. I hope China would be accepted and brought into the world fold as a partner, and not a belligerent one, more aligned with Russia than the Western values. But regardless, I'm still going to make these videos on China, and I just want to let everyone know that if I do catch a ban and you don't see me for a couple days, you can catch me at @CPScott16 on TikTok, or you can go to my YouTube channel, which is just CP Scott, or go to my profile, click the play button. Now, this is going to talk about the real estate market, and I get a lot of this information from Business Insider, The Economist, various Chinese publications, internal Department of State stuff, Business Basics, places like Foreign Affairs, etc. So there's a lot of people that do a lot of studying in this area, and I just aggregate it. And we also saw those videos of tanks being deployed to China to deal with the bank runs. But that was largely debunked. Not the bank runs; those really happened. But the tanks being deployed, that was just a training scenario, which is weird that they'd be training for that, because it seemed like they were training for civil unrest. Neither here nor there in this video. The reality is China does have a real problem in their real estate sector. Real estate represents 30% of the Chinese GDP, and the average Chinese citizen has 70% of their investments in real estate. That means a good chunk of them have 100% of their investments in real estate. This is a very scary problem if there was going to be a real estate downturn, not only for the broader economy, but also for people in general as their investments. Now, over the last 2 decades, this was created by a self-perpetuating fear of missing out, where China wanted real estate to drive their economy, and it did. And all the way down to the internal business advertising of you weren't really a man unless you owned property or you owned some sort of real estate. So it drove a fear of missing out. Now, people were buying houses before construction even began. That doesn't sound like a problem, though, because that's what happens in the US sometimes. Companies like Evergrande would lease a piece of land from the government and then sell the house to the people, and then they would incur a mortgage on that house and start paying it. The problem is Evergrande wouldn't use the money to build the house. They would use the money to show that they had an asset to lease more land, to then get more mortgage payments from people, to then get more loans, and just continue to perpetuate it in a pyramid scheme without really constructing any homes. This wasn't an issue because real estate demand was so high. And when demand was high, people were more than happy to take out the mortgages on the promise that they would eventually get a house because it was so highly sought after. The big problem is Evergrande wouldn't start construction with the money. So you can see how this is already a big issue. You'd think regulation would come into play, and the problem for the Chinese Communist Party is they distributed the regulation of such things down to the local level. Well, local governments were reaping the windfall of land purchases because the leases to Evergrande and other real estate companies were filling the coffers of these local governments. And it doesn't even cover the corruption, which I'm not even going to go into here. But needless to say, China liked getting this lease money. Some provinces got 50% of their revenue from leasing land to companies like Evergrande. So of course they weren't going to regulate it because they were making money for their own pet projects. This alone creates an enormous real estate bubble, greater than the 2008 real estate bubble in the US. And cracks started to form, obviously. This isn't even the worst part of it, because Evergrande would list these houses that they hadn't built, but they had received money for and then turned around and used for more leases and loans as an asset on their balance sheet to get more loans for banks and try to finish some of the construction on the houses they already sold to people, but they usually just used the loans to continue to perpetually buy land from the government. So they never started building the houses or the apartments, or at least they didn't start building them fast enough to keep up with what they were promising by a long shot. So I don't think in the history of ever there's been a more leveraged industry than the Chinese real estate industry right now. So just to recap, these real estate companies made plans to build homes, sold the homes before the materials were even on the ledger as a budget item, then turned around and levied the already sold homes as an asset on their balance sheet to increase the value of future loans. It only worked thus far because the Chinese government was guaranteeing these loans. But that means the government is over-leveraged now, and taxpayers are on the hook for the bailouts, to the tone of the first bailout being $1 trillion. The U.S. bailout after 2008 was $498 billion. Also, the only way this works is if it continues to grow going forever. Well, that won't happen because you can't have unlimited real estate because you're limited on the land you can have, and China has a population decrease coming, which is why many buildings that were constructed remain empty. On top of that, trust in Evergrande's ability to stay solvent crumbled when they started missing payments because they couldn't continue to use loans to pay other loans. Does this sound familiar? Sounds like Enron, right? Enron had $38 billion in liabilities before it went under and took hundreds of people's money with it. And that was in the energy sector. Evergrande's real estate sector liabilities are north of $300 billion. And I keep saying Evergrande, but they weren't the only ones doing this. They were just the largest one doing this. Almost every real estate company in China was operating this way. And it seems like this industry, on paper, just on paper from what we know, is over-leveraged by $5.3 trillion with a T. $5.3 trillion. This is the worst possible scenario, and hundreds of times worse than Enron. When I read 5.3 trillion in over leverage, I dropped my phone and was shocked. Millions of people are going to lose their livelihoods. And that's where banking comes in. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to help these real estate companies by building projects, helping build the projects. But even ones that were sold in 2019 remained unfinished. Some started decades ago and aren't finished. New sales that are coming, anyone who wants to continue to think that this system works, are paying into a system where only their money isn't going to construction anymore. It's going to pay off loans. And some of these projects are delayed more than a decade. Home buyers and investors, some of whom have their whole life savings placed in these real estate ventures, have begun asking where their home is, and they're given excuses. So they started to demand their money back. Unfortunately, in the banking system, this hard cash was leveraged into these loans. So they didn't have enough cash on hand to give it out. That's where these bank runs came from. So what did these people do? Well, they stopped paying their mortgages. Something like 300 development projects across China are now not receiving their mortgage payments. 30 to 50,000 people have stopped paying their mortgages because they don't see the house they're supposed to be getting. That's worth $100 billion in real estate debt that is no longer receiving payments, and that number is growing. To stem the growth of this, the Chinese Communist Party decided to tell the media to stop publishing mortgage default numbers. This is an economic firestorm that is headed for China over the next few years, and it's going to get worse than the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, and that cost the world $2 trillion. This could cost China alone $6 to $8 trillion. That will lead to their collapse. Unlike 2008, there's no homes for Evergrande and China to repossess so they can liquidate and get some money back on their investment. They didn't build anything. It was a pyramid scheme. So there's no way they can recoup that. So the banks are going to eat all of that debt. And that's because of that, they're limiting their withdrawals. And that's when they limit the withdrawals, that leads to bank runs. And when bank runs happen, that leads to bank collapses because people want their money so they can do things like, buy food. So banks and investors and millions, possibly even tens of millions of people are going to lose everything. And when that happens, all roads lead to Beijing and Xi Jinping. So we'll see what happens.